Hey, kids. It's story time. That's how it feels sitting in this chair. Um, with my book on my lap, I feel like I'm about to do story time. But instead of talking to children, we are telling some intense stories to grown-ups. All right, so this chapter is entitled Resistance, Repression, and Retrenchment, 1967 to 1978. As I previously mentioned, I think we should actually go back 1 year to 1966 from the previous chapter, in which we are introduced to the concept of Black Power. We are introduced to the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, and a whole bunch of other important things happened in 1966. So just really briefly, and also I'll say these things set us up for understanding the rest of this time period. So in 1966, you have the establishment of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California. And the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense really is kind of like the symbolic, like iconic organization to represent what is called revolutionary nationalism. So we're still dealing with this concept of Black nationalism, Black people understanding or seeing themselves as a nation within this nation without a destiny that has the same pathway as mainstream America, certainly without the same struggles as mainstream America, struggles caused by mainstream America in most cases. So revolutionary nationalism is really based on studying more leftist ideas. Communism, these young people are studying Mao Zedong, and they're studying Karl Marx and, like generations ahead of them, right? So we can date that all the way back to the 30s. But their focus, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, is self-defense. And that's why it's important to say the whole title, the whole name of the organization, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, because they're really originally about protection of the Black community against police brutality. It's a problem now. It was a problem then, right? So this is 1966, and it's still, and some people have argued it's even worse now than it was then. The over-policing of Black communities, racial profiling, stop and frisk, of course, police murders, racial injustice inside prisons. All of those are issues in this chapter, but they are issues still today. So that is one branch of the movement that kind of represents this type of political activity, these priorities about political freedom, and kind of this economic critique. Now, on the other side of this nationalist idea, you have organizations like the US organization, which is also kind of sprouting up and becoming more prominent in 1966, although I believe it was established earlier. And the US organization is established by Maulana Karenga. I didn't say this, but the book does. Black Panther Party for Self-Defense is founded by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. And they study the law. So these two guys got together and did that. Maulana Karenga is the man who establishes the US organization. And I'm not sure if US stands for literally just the word us, or if it stands for United Slaves. I've heard all kinds of different interpretations. But what is important to know about the US organization is that they believe that for Black people, the most important thing would be for us to return to a healthy state culturally, psychologically, emotionally. Where is that moment in time in our history where we were healthy and we were self-reliant and we were whole? And, according to Dr. Karenga, it was when we were still in Africa. The last time we've been healthy is, perhaps even 600 years ago. So this is before European colonization and slavery. So he's like, maybe we need to return to that. We need to return to African values, our African heritage, African spirituality, African aesthetics of like hair and clothes and what beauty looks like, and have our own separate African standards, our own separate African culture, because trying to be a part of European culture has caused us to hate ourselves, It has not helped our situation. It has not endeared us to white America. We're still getting beat down and excluded. And so, like, why continue to fight for white acceptability? Like, let's just love our African stuff. So that's the idea. And in 1966, going into the beginning of 1967, you have your first Kwanzaa celebration. So the US organization, specifically Maulana Karenga and the people in his organization, the people around him, they established the holiday of Kwanzaa. Some of you may have actually celebrated Kwanzaa. I celebrate Kwanzaa every year. And it's a holiday, but it's not spiritual. It is not like a religious holiday at all. It is a cultural and political holiday. So Kwanzaa can be celebrated by anybody of any faith because it's really just a celebration of African heritage. And there's so much more I can say about that, but let me move on. So resistance, repression, and retrenchment. 1967 is just a critical year, guys. Like, I think most of the history we learn of the 60s focuses on 1968, but 1967 is really when things reach a boiling point. You have a young man who is kind of there at the top of your chapter, H. Rap Brown. And he is really important because in any discussion of, Black power, you talk to an old head, an elder person who was alive and young and vibrant at this time, the first thing they'll say is burn, baby, burn. Because that's one of the slogans they got from him. And as you saw on page, well, you guys don't have pages, section, and it's actually really the intro. Just before the chronology section, he says, if America don't come around, we're gonna burn it down. Okay. So he takes over as head of SNCC, SNCC, after Stokely Carmichael's 1 year as the chair of SNCC. So now that SNCC is under H. Rap Brown, he is steering them very directly into a more aggressive, defiant stance as an organization. Even though the organization is Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he is putting violence on the table as something that may be necessary for us to meet our goals, because all the nonviolence and peacefulness has not been working. And in this chapter, he does a lot of work in the state of Maryland, our state, and his arch nemesis is the Maryland state governor at this time, a man named Spiro Agnew, or Spyro, I don't know. So they kind of put these two together, particularly in the media, as kind of like enemies. Spyro Agnew really wins his race and kind of comes to popularity by having this tough on crime, law and order type of platform. And, this is helping to kind of comfort white Marylanders who are afraid of these young people who now want to fight back. They now want to defend themselves from violence. They're not going to just sit and get hosed down and chewed up by dogs without fighting back. They're like, I will shoot your dog. Okay. So it's a very different mindset, a very different energy. And so white Americans, and that is North and South, are looking for political leaders who will crack down on this, crack down on these young people who have, according to them, kind of gotten out of pocket. But of course, within our community, we're kind of like, it's understandable. So the hot summer of 67. Another important thing that I want you to know about this whole unit really is that the battleground here is no longer the South. It is the urban North. It is the cities of the North, the Midwest, New York, Detroit, Chicago. You have all, Newark, New Jersey. You have all these places up north. College campuses become a battleground. And that's really, really important because previously you almost had the impression that racism was just a Southern thing, and that like if you just got to the North, things would be okay. But in the James Baldwin video that I posted for you earlier, he makes that very important point that like racism in the South is at least honest and easy to see. In the North, the racism is more subtle. And that actually makes it more difficult because you don't know which place you go will be acceptable and tolerable and will tolerate you as a Black person, and which places you go will be hostile and violent. So you're kind of like on edge all the time because you don't even know. In the South, it's like, I can't go nowhere. I know what I'm up against. I know who's going to call me a nigger, you know, and treat me as such. And in the North, you're like, someone could smile on my face and block me from getting into this school I want to go to because I'm Black, you know, but so it's trickier. In any case, so this is the battleground. This is what it looks like. And so these young people are kind of like, I'm just going to bust through all of that. I don't care if you call me the N-word to my face or not. I'm going to get what I came for. And I'm not apologizing for it. I'm not going to be nice about it because we tried that. The gloves are now off. This summer of 67 is similar to summer of 1943, summer of 1946, summer of 1919, race riots. And there's one in Newark, New Jersey, in which 23 people are killed and I think 1,000 are injured. Also that year in Detroit, there's another race incident in which 43 people were killed, and it says in the book like 7,000 people were arrested. I'm like, how Sway? Like, how did they arrest 7,000 people? Like, where do they put them? It's the first thing that always pops up into my head when I think about that. Like, that's staggering. Obviously they had military support to do that. They had you know, vans and extra force that was called in to do this. So it also kind of lends itself to like this understanding of like the collaboration between the federal government or the state government and the police, the local police force. Also that year, though, is the National Conference on Black Power. This is shortly after the Newark riot. These young people got together, all of these different civil rights organizations. SNCC was there, SCLC was there, even though Martin Luther King was, you know, in SCLC and kind of helming that organization. He did not attend the Black Power Conference. The Nation of Islam even stuck a toe into politics and came to this conference. CORE was at this conference. Also, the Deacons for Defense was at this conference, which I think is significant because even though the Deacons for Defense was an armed group of church brothers who, you know, took up these arms to protect their communities against, you know, white violence, they became more popular and more visible at this time because these young people were trying to learn from them. They were trying to learn from more militant groups, self-defense groups, on how they could adopt these ideas and put them into practice. How do we defend ourselves? So they were there. So this is really significant. This is a very important moment of unity, right? For all these organizations, or potential for unity. That is the goal. Even the young poet Amiri Baraka, he shows up. He's from Newark, New Jersey, so he shows up to the conference still wounded from the riot, you know what I mean? And he's just like, they did this to me. You know, so, you know, the motivation and the sense of urgency is there when they meet, because they're like, they are beating us down. They just beat us down right here, like right here in this city. All this went down. Like, this is why we need this meeting. So, yeah, so there's that. And there's so much more about that, but there's a movie even about like the Detroit riot that happens that summer. Well, the Detroit race incident is called Detroit. I haven't watched it yet. I don't know if I should recommend it or not, but it's based on that story. The book also traces the kind of educational, political route of Angela Davis, although it doesn't really talk a lot about why she's important. She starts off as a young girl in Birmingham, who actually knows one or more of the 4 little girls who were killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing there. Another person who grew up in that community and knew some of those girls was Condoleezza Rice. So Angela Davis and Condoleezza Rice come from the same Birmingham community. Can you imagine? Like, there are no two more different life paths than Angela Davis and Condi, but go figure. So after that, Angela Davis's parents send her to New York City to go to high school. Then from there, she goes to Europe. I think she's in Paris, and she's in Germany, and then she returns to the United States, as, freshly out of college, or, college age person. And she finds herself in the middle of this youth revolt, right? This youth revolt in the late 60s. She's able to be in the middle of this Black Power moment, this Black Power energy, this Black Power slogan, and young people putting this into practice. She's studying communism, so definitely would end up more on the revolutionary nationalist side of things. On the cultural nationalist side of things, you have just this flourishing of an appreciation for Africanity. Like, we're growing out our hair that's, in its natural state. We're not straightening it. The afro, or they call it the natural, is popular. Even James Brown had to temporarily cut his perm off. I think he went back to the perm, obviously, but he comes out with the song "Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud." You have artists like Gil Scott-Heron, who does his iconic song "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," which is a critique of capitalism and how, all these corporations and capitalists want to kind of infiltrate the movement and like sponsor the movement. But you can't be really about that life if you have corporate sponsorship. You can't have like the Black Revolution sponsored by Coca-Cola. Like, you can't do that. And you can't be about the revolution from your couch. You can't like watch it on TV every night on the news and be like, yeah. You know what I mean? You can't be a hashtag activist. That would be today's version probably of that. Like, just forwarding stuff on Twitter or your Facebook page or, Instagram, or like mentioning it on your Snapchat is not activism. That's what he's saying. The revolution is not about pretty faces, handsome young people on television. Like, it is about the work. That's the song. Other important people that aren't really discussed in your book are the last poets. They're literally called the last poets, and they're thought of as the fathers of hip hop. Them, and also sometimes Gil Scott-Heron, the fathers of hip hop music, which emerges from New York. But you also have to add DJ Kool Herc in there, bringing the reggae sound. Like, without Caribbean folks in New York, you don't have hip hop. Without jazz in New York, you don't have hip hop. Like, without this revolutionary poetry and this spoken word over music, you don't have hip hop. So they really break the mold. Amiri Baraka's poetry, he has, his goal at this time is to write poems that kill. Like, you saw that in the book. I even posted his poem for you called Black Art. And it's, it's not polite. I'll put it that way. It's not polite. And the goal is to be impolite. The goal is to be aggressive. The goal is to talk about the ugliness that Black people are experiencing in ugly ways, to like kind of evoke a connection to it, like to let people feel it, really feel it. Like, this is ugly. We're not going to be cute and polite about it. We're not going to ask and beg and use sweet terms to talk to white America to like, please politely stop killing us. It's like, this is what is going on. This is the corruption. These are the Negroes who have sold us out. Like, they're putting like artistic and cultural pressure on everybody to be about that revolution. And if you're not for the revolution, you're against the revolution. There's no in between. So they put pressure again on people like James Brown. They're trying to, get people to go natural, wear African clothing. A lot of people are changing their names. And we saw that process had started before in the earlier part of the 60s. They're reading Black books and opening Black bookstores. They're starting Black institutions, like Black cultural centers, Black independent schools, like elementary schools for children, because they're like the public school system. Yeah, we're integrated into it, but it's teaching us Eurocentric like history and culture, and basically we're being educated to hate ourselves. We're being educated to work for our masters and against ourselves. And so there was that movement for schools, and then also the Black Studies movement. So the reason why I get to sit here and talk to you and about this stuff is because of these students in the 60s, in the late 60s, who took over administration buildings at their universities and said, we want to learn Black history, Black culture, Black studies, Black approaches to all these disciplines. Like, we're tired of learning everything through a white person's lens. particularly at places like Bowie State and Howard, which I thought was kind of interesting that they mentioned those in the book. Tuskegee, San Francisco State is where it really begins. But, in Howard in particular, they have a conference in 1968 called the Toward a Black University Conference. They're like, we are all Black here at Howard, but this is not a Black school. This is not a Black university because you don't teach nothing Black. You don't teach anything from the Black perspective. We don't learn Black history. We're not using our knowledge really to further the Black community. We're just using our knowledge to integrate into white America and give them all of our talents and knowledge. So we want a Black university. How do we get that? We want Black studies. How do we get that? So they pushed for that. And, they won. And we don't win a whole lot in this book, but these young people won some battles, but they realized that they had to go to war for it. On the flip side of that, you've got revolutionary nationalism, cultural nationalism, and there's some overlap, right? So the revolutionary nationalists are also wearing their hair natural, changing their names to African names or Muslim names, all those other things. They just haven't gone all the way to Africa. You know what I mean? But then you still have Black moderates. You have Black people who are on a more conservative end of the spectrum. You have Thurgood Marshall, who was just appointed to the Supreme Court in 1967 as a Supreme Court justice. You have people like Sidney Poitier, the actor, who is, kind of America's sweetheart, kind of like Jackie Robinson in baseball. Like, he is thought of as a safe Negro, a good Negro. He's in the film Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, where he is this highly educated, eloquent Black man who is dating a rather mediocre white woman. And has, he meets her family, and it's like a whole thing. But he is putting out this idea that, we still want to be with you, white America. We aspire to be our best versions of you. And, again, these radical young people are like, no, that is coonery and it's unacceptable, and get yourself together, Sydney. So he does try to branch out into some more Black focused, Black centric, politically conscious roles in films, and with mixed success, right? You have Martin Luther King, of course, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who again is still with the SCLC, but has open hostility with SNCC. Even though and the media, of course, is blowing all of this up. Even though he does disagree with their methods, and the kind of direction that SNCC is now going in, he does sympathize. He does understand the anger and the rage that they have, and that, they've run out of patience, right? The 50s was about patience. Walking miles and miles to work instead of getting on a segregated bus, sitting at a lunch counter while people pour ketchup on your head and spit on you. It was about patience. And these young people are like, none of that. Malcolm X told us that if we don't love ourselves, that's the only reason why we would take abuse like that. It's because we don't love ourselves. We're not going to do the I don't really love myself, I'm going to subject myself to reckless abuse type of, nah, we're not doing that no more. So here in 19.2, King says, we're taking the young Black men who have been crippled by our society and sending them 8,000 miles away to guarantee liberties in Southeast Asia, which they had not found in Southwest Georgia and East Harlem. He's talking about the Vietnam War. It was difficult, King said, to persuade African Americans to remain nonviolent while the nation used massive doses of violence in Vietnam. I knew, this is quote, I knew I could never again raise my voice against the violence of the oppressed in the ghettos without having first spoken clearly to the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. The greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, he says, is my own government. He says, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching a spiritual death. So he understands the violence. He understands the violence of the youth in the ghettos. He understands their response to not wanting to go and fight this war in Vietnam, that they're being kind of disproportionately pushed into by the military. because he's like, the United States is committing acts of like flagrant, unfair, unjust violence overseas. And they're forcing us, black and brown people, to do that in the name of America, but they're committing violence against us here, and they're not trying to solve that problem. And so, we're spending most of our money on war, and we still do, obviously. More money on war than healthcare, more money on war than education, more money on war than helping veterans, elderly. It's the biggest budget item of our national budget, military. In any case, so this is Martin Luther King's critique. So he becomes openly against the Vietnam War. Remember, I think I mentioned the three giants, the three heads of the American giant, he says, are militarism, racism, and extreme materialism, but really like poverty. So economic oppression. Those are the three giants, or three monsters. And so because he's against militarism, he's against the Vietnam War, he's against poverty, he starts the Poor People's Campaign. And of course, he's still against violence, like on the local level. And unfortunately, he is assassinated in 1968. On April 4th, he's shot by a white supremacist named James Earl Ray, who was propped up by the FBI. Because, it was one thing to be against racism, but now you're trying to discuss Vietnam monies, how we spend taxpayer dollars, how much we're not doing to help the poor, how the capitalist system has created poverty in this country and the rest of the world. Yeah, we don't want you talking about that stuff. You gotta go. So anyway, the book also in this chapter mentions some really good books that I think you should read. They mention Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. He's a Caribbean, he's a psychiatrist, he is a philosopher, he's a political theorist, he's a soldier. He went and volunteered to fight in the Algerian War against the French. He's from Martinique, a French-speaking island. He's really writing about how violence itself can be therapeutic. If someone's committing violence against you and you commit violence back against them, like that's healthy. It gives you a sense of resolution. Like if you continue to get beat down and you don't do anything and you don't respond with equal force, that is what is going to cause trauma. That is what is going to eat you away and cause disturbances. Another good book is Black Power. It's written by Stokely Carmichael, who eventually changes his name to Kwame Ture. It's called Black Power: The Politics of Liberation in America. And it's really the classic text that people read to really understand. He outlines what Black Power is. Like, what is the philosophy of Black Power? What is it about? What are they asking for? What does it mean? So before you start talking about Black Power was this and that, and, in the media, they portray it as like all these other things, kind of like this crazy caricature. Really read the philosophy, because it's a very serious political idea. You've got Amiri Baraka with his Poems That Kill, but you also have Nikki Giovanni, Sonia Sanchez, Maya Angelou. You've got a bunch of women writers who are doing equally as revolutionary work that is equally as revolutionary. The chapter then switches gears to the riots of 1968 over Martin Luther King's death, his assassination. And this is, again, the Emmett Till effect, the Four Little Girls effect. Like, the death of the peaceful, peace-loving, nonviolent leader, the killing of him causes just outrage. And some of those Black people who are sitting on their couch get up off that couch and get involved, because they're just like, this is too much. You have gone too far. You have killed the peacekeeper. You have killed the one man who was trying to hold us back from fighting you back. You took him out too? Like, this is too much. So there are riots. The Black people, young people particularly, of course, they riot in the streets. They burning it down. They're like, and a lot of people look at these riots and like, why do Black people burn down their own neighborhoods when they riot? I'm like, no. They're burning down institutions, businesses, and other things in their neighborhoods that they don't own. The whole point of the riot is to send the message like, we don't own our own community. Everybody else comes into our community, the Jewish community, the Asian community, like the white community, the Irish, the Polish, everybody comes into our community to make money off of us, but block us from owning our own stuff. Like, that is part of the thing we're struggling against, like lack of ownership. You have made us into a race of renters, and we're always at the mercy of other people who own, because you block us with high interest rates, you block us with redlining, you block us with all kinds of predatory lending practices, you block us with food deserts and housing deserts and job deserts, where literally the way you structured it is like, we can't even get a decent job to get a decent living wage around here. So we're barely surviving, much less having enough extra income to like buy and own things, right? So all of this is the reason for riots. They're not burning down their own stuff. They don't own that stuff. They're burning that because it represents their oppression. So there were riots in all of the major cities in this country in 1968. So Vietnam, back to Vietnam. So if I were you, I would go on the Smithsonian Learning Lab and just type in African American Vietnam. Just type it in and just kind of like look through all of the results, because they're just so interesting. All these different posters and propaganda and photographs of like Black soldiers and Black protests against Vietnam. Like, there was just so much feeling around Vietnam. I mean, young white people were against the war as well, And then they instituted the draft, which means, men, all young men, in a certain age group were selected from a lottery randomly to serve in this war, even though, as you read in the book, it was definitely disproportionately Black and brown and poor young men who were selected to go fight this war. So, miraculously, people like your president and other wealthy people were able to avoid being drafted into this war and did not serve. And, the Black men who served were called Bloods. That's what we called each other, Blood. What's up, Blood? Just so you know, and there's a good book called Blood. And there's so much more that needs to be said that is not in this book about the impact of Vietnam. There are people who argue that Vietnam really is the reason why the Black community is as messed up as it is today, like psychologically and emotionally in the family structure. That Vietnam is what messed us up. We could talk about slavery and Jim Crow and convict leasing and all these other, but like, we might have survived those things. We might have still survived with our families intact and our minds somewhat intact. But Vietnam was like the thing that crumbled us, because so many of our young men were sent over there. They were, of course, subject to racism. Even though this is supposed to be a desegregated military. They were subject to all kinds of government experiments, chemical testing on these soldiers. Just their brains were messed with. Like, they just came back traumatized because the rules of engagement were essentially violated in this war. They were forced to do just unspeakable things over there, not just to the Viet Cong, the revolutionary Vietnamese, but also to women and children. So things that directly challenged their sense of morality, their ethics, they just came back broken down because of the things that they saw over there. And they weren't the same. And that's why we have a lot of homeless veterans that were in the Vietnam War, they came back in pieces, missing arms and legs, and just, because again, with each war, there's new war technology, and the ability to do more and more destruction to, a body. So, and because they were put either, again, in the worst, most dangerous working conditions, the most detestable, disgusting working conditions, or they were put right there on the front combat lines, like, yeah, they got the worst of it. Muhammad Ali is the young boxer formerly known as Cassius Clay, who also joins the Nation of Islam because he's he's drawn in by Malcolm X and connects then with the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And so because of this, he is against the war. He refuses to go fight in this war. And so he's given a prison sentence for that. They stripped him of his championship title. So, there's a lot going on. They talk about a young Colin Powell, and his observations of the Bloods in Vietnam, the black soldiers, and what they're going through. Although, Colin Powell is not necessarily the friend to these Bloods. And there's so much more I could say about the role he plays in the U.S. military. The word sellout comes to mind, but and that's not an opinion. That is really like the general thinking about him based on the things he did that were completely destructive and oppressive to his own community, our own people. So another learning lab search I would recommend is Black Panther Party. Just type in those in the search bar and just see what comes up, and just scroll through that. You'll see a lot of interesting artifacts. The Black Beret. Some of you guys use that for your artifact analysis and stuff. Like, you'll see a lot of artwork, and what you might notice is some of the artwork looks like the same artist did it, like the same kind of shapes of people and aesthetics and the same kind of handwriting for the letters. That is a guy named Emory Douglas. He's a young artist who was a part of the Black Panther Party in he was I don't know, as a minister of propaganda, but he created a lot of their posters, their recruitment posters, these political posters that would go out with their flyers or their statements, their public statements. So then there's a whole book of just his artwork. Some of it was just super amazing, always had a message. So yeah. So again, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense is focused initially on armed self-defense and police patrolling in our communities. They did a huge demonstration at the state capitol of California. The leader at this point, the most vocal person, was Huey Newton, who was, of course, summarily arrested for alleged murder that was later found that he did not commit. And the government's response to this, Lyndon B. Johnson's response, he's the Civil Rights Act guy, he's the Voting Rights Act guy. We thought that was so great, but he also establishes or gives a green light to the establishment of COINTELPRO. COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Program. And this is a specific FBI program that is geared towards surveilling and destroying the youth revolt, Black Power organizations, Students for a Democratic Society, you name it. Even in your book in 19.4.3, that section is called Targeting the Black Messiah, because literally now you can go and look in documents, FBI documents from COINTELPRO, and see that they literally say word for word that they are an organization, and the mission is to, target and destroy and prevent the rise of a Black Messiah among the youth. Yeah. Another thing in your book, it specifically says the FBI stepped up COINTELPRO in 1968 by developing plans to, quote, prevent a coalition of militant Black nationalist groups. So they're not only trying to prevent like the rise of that next major guy after King is dead, but they also want to prevent like all these organizations from coming together. This is why the Black Power Conference of 1967, they try to have one in 1968 in Bermuda, which is supposed to not just bring together all the civil rights organizations in America, but also in the Caribbean. There's even Black Panthers and Black Power movement going on in Australia, because we're just catching hell everywhere. So these young people from all over the world who are Black, who are like, they come together and they attempt to have this Black Power Conference to kind of follow up on the previous one. So the FBI is like hell bent on keeping people away from this. They put travel bans on a lot of the young people here in the States, so they can't go and organize in these other countries. And, MI6 from England and the Canadian Secret Service and the CIA and the Australian Secret Service, they collaborate to try to keep these other young people from coming here. They're literally like blocking people, like blocking the planes from taking off when they get on the planes. Some of the young men even like dress like in disguises to be able to try to get on these planes to like get together. So it's just a crazy time. Yeah. Before I leave the whole Black Power thing with the Black Panthers and the conferences, I wanted to mention the 10-point platform for the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. That's so important because once Huey is in jail or in prison, he's still talking, he's still communicating, probably through phone calls, etc., letters, and kind of steering some, the party in some kinds of ways. And one of the things that the party does is refocus on survival programs. That is the free breakfast program, the building of free clinics, freedom schools, where they're teaching Black history and culture, and political education to not just like young adults, but also to children, the elderly, whoever wants to take part in these programs. They're really organized to get the community to provide for itself, which is amazing, and it was effective. But they wanted to put out this 10-point platform so everybody was very clear on what they were asking for. And I posted it for you on Blackboard, so I hope you read it. It's really, really good. Yeah, let me know your thoughts on that. Eldridge Cleaver, he's a Black Panther Party member who was mentioned in the book, who is not a good guy. This man is a whole rapist who somehow was allowed into the party after being released from prison. When you talk to elders today, they kind of mention people like him, and like, we made some mistakes. He was one of them. Because they were trying to be about the people, and these ideas of communism kind of were the driving force. Like, they let a lot of people in. They were like, your criminal past shouldn't block you from being able to fight for liberation. But in some ways, there probably should have been a different kind of vetting process to make sure that people with like bad character couldn't just come into the organization, and certainly not rise to prominent positions within the organization. So in hindsight, they will sit you down. Elders I've talked to when I was a little young head would sit you down and say, like, here are the things that we did that were successful, and the things that worked, and here are the things that we did that didn't work. And that's important, so you don't reproduce those mistakes when you go out there and try to keep your people viable on this planet. All right. So we talked about the establishment of Black studies programs in 1967 and 68. The book also mentions briefly Black sports. Muhammad Ali is not the only one who is kind of using his platform for resistance. You have the Olympics in 1968 in Mexico City, where you have Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who put up the Black Power salute during the playing of the national anthem at the Olympic Games on the platform. Some Black athletes just boycotted altogether and were like, I'm not participating. They wanted a blockade put on South Africa and Rhodesia. Like, South Africa and Rhodesia should not be allowed to participate in the Olympics because they practice apartheid, and they're oppressing the African people who live there and who have an indigenous right to freedom and basic humanity in their own land. So they should not be able to participate. Of course, Tommy and John suffered greatly, and their careers were destroyed after this point. All right. COINTELPRO. There's a good documentary about COINTELPRO and how intense it was. And I posted it. It's called The FBI's War on Black America. I highly recommend it, just so you know what was done. I'm also going to try to find this article about political prisoners, because again, you've got a whole slew of young people who are locked up in prison who didn't commit any crimes. Those are what you call political prisoners. They are locked up for their ideas. They are locked up for asking for the United States Constitution to be practiced literally for everybody, fairly. They are in prison for not wanting to be polite about it. They're in prison because they're seen as a threat, because Black people having fairness and justice is seen as a threat. So that is a political prisoner. So a lot of them, a good number of them guys are still there. Do you understand? Like 40 years they've been in there. Like there's at least 19 major political prisoners who are still serving time today. And some of them are, you know, have just recently been released, like in the last 5 years, 10 years. But they, you know, went in at age 19, you know what I mean? So literally their whole adult life was spent in prison because of what they were fighting for. Like that's a major sacrifice. Not just that some of them died or like were killed by the FBI or the police or like a white mob, but like languished in prison, and, you know, dozens are still there. For you and me to be able to sit here and have this conversation. So the COINTELPRO, or the counterintelligence program, arrested them. They killed them. They burned down their structures. I mean, they even tried to burn down, you know, the little breakfast programs, you know, the little centers where they would have the children eating, little Black children eating breakfast and stuff. Like, dropped the bombs, you know, other types of incendiaries. They tried to intimidate them. They tried to infiltrate them. This is really important. Like, what people don't understand is the point was to plot to destroy these organizations from the inside. They would get, you know, Black informants within the organizations, threaten them with some sort of like, you know, we'll destroy your life, or we will lock you up for, you know, this charge or that charge if you don't collaborate with us and give us information. They would send people into these organizations as spies who would cause problems in the organizations. I mean, they would try to turn the organizations against each other, like the US organization versus SNCC and the Panthers versus us, and, you know, like and have them fighting amongst each other over things that were not even true, make false phone calls. The FBI was underhanded and dirty. I don't even know. There's no scholarly way to say that. Like, underhanded, dirty, deceptive, to try and tear these organizations down. And they weren't quiet about it. They weren't shy or secretive about it. You can go and read all of what they were doing, all of the people who they either flipped to work for them or forced to work for them. These, you know, Black people who didn't want to do this work but were forced to for various reasons. Some Black people did do it willingly, though. There's always that person who wants to work for the man and, you know, get rewarded for it, to work against his or her own people. But, you know, anyway, watch the documentary. All right. Another thing that I would recommend checking out is Blood in My Eye. That's another important book by the young man that's mentioned in this chapter, George Jackson, who is a prisoner. He writes he writes all these letters to his brother in a book. The collection of his letters is in a book called Soledad, Brother. And then Blood in My Eye is another book he writes just before he's killed in 1971, attempting to escape from prison. And again, this is like his political theories. He's in San Quentin, by the way. He's in prisons in San Quentin, subject to racism within prison. His younger brother's killed outside of prison. And again, these are politically minded young men who are theorizing and really kind of explaining very clearly like what they see going on in society. So these books, these texts are very important. In the wake of George Jackson's murder in prison, you have the Attica Rebellion in New York, in Attica, that prison. Again, and that's in 1971. And so a bunch of inmates who are Black and brown rise up and protest against the deplorable, inhumane conditions that they suffer in the prison. And they're like, you know, we lost a lot of our freedoms for crimes, but we don't lose our human rights. Like, you still have to treat us like human beings. So there's that. Also, I would, and this is so out of order, I'm sorry, I would redirect you to an article I posted about the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense Free Breakfast Program, because the breakfast program model that they created was taken by, I believe, the USDA and the Department of Education and used to create the free breakfast and lunch program we have now in public schools. Like the one y'all probably had growing up, or at least I did, some of y'all. I was a free breakfast and lunch student because mama was poor. And it's, that program was based on their model. Like, so even though the government was brutal and repressive and hateful toward these young people, they borrowed some of their really good ideas. After this, another strategy to discredit these young people wasn't the government. It came from Hollywood. Hollywood reinvents and reimagines the movement and kind of tries to discredit Black power, make it something to laugh about, making these young Black people like, these angry, ignorant, pompous jerks who don't know what they're talking about. So we see these in Blaxploitation films. So, Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song is like a Black film writer, director, Melvin Van Peebles, who makes a film about a Black young man who is angered by the killing of a young Black person in his community and goes on a rampage of revenge against the cops, aka the pigs. And after Hollywood sees the success of this very low budget film and understands like Black people really want to see themselves as the heroes, they start making all these crazy films with Black people as the hero, but they're like anti-heroes. Like, they are heroes, but their moral compass doesn't point north. Like, they get revenge against the man, or like white people, or like, white women, white men, but it never makes sense. Like, it's never completely justified because they're like halfway criminals themselves, like the Black people. And, the Black women in these films are usually hypersexualized, and the men too. There's lots of drug use, lots of sex, lots of cussing and profanity and self-hatred and all kind of other things going on. So they're basically saying like, this is what these young people are like. They're really just a bunch of criminals. They're not really freedom fighters. That's what Blaxploitation films are. That's what Black people started to call them, because they were like, these films are exploiting our movement. But we still have that, like this caricature, this like exaggeration of like a Black power person in TV and movies. And they're always like comic relief, which I think is just disrespectful to what these young people really went through. One person who I think is so important to Black power, the Black power movement, who is missing from this chapter is Fred Hampton. Like, he's heading the Black Panther Party chapter in Chicago, Illinois, and he's assassinated in 1969. I believe he was 21 years old. This young man was just brilliant, courageous. What made him super threatening is not only was he helping feed people and building a free clinic, but he also was trying to get poor white people to understand that capitalism works against them too, and that we have a common enemy, which is the elite, wealthy white people who are pulling all the strings. And like, if we just unify Black people and poor white people, like that might do something. So that was real scary. And that's another reason why he had to be taken out. And they had this whole thing that, they tried to make it seem as though he was in a shootout with the police. And since he shot at them, they shot back and killed him. But like, all forensics show very clearly that the bullets were only coming from one direction. That is outside the house. They shot him in his bed. I think his pregnant girlfriend was with him in the bed. She survived. He has a son who survived. But it was just tragic. I posted a video where you can see like him at a meeting, like, and just like him doing his stuff, like what he was doing. And there's tons of speeches and stuff on the internet. Another person who's conspicuously absent in this chapter, but who needs to be in there, is Assata Shakur. Assata, if you want to, again, say that you have studied Black folk stuff and taken it seriously and covered all your bases, you need to read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And then right after that, you need to read Assata, about this woman's life. This woman started off as, a poet and a scholar and just an intelligent young Black woman. She joins the Black Panther Party for self-defense, moves into the Black Liberation Army and goes underground. Not only is she a revolutionary nationalist, but she's very interested in history and culture. Of course, like many of these young people, she's set up by the law. They say she killed a state trooper in New Jersey. she and two other Black Panthers. And so she's put in prison for this murder and is able to escape from prison, y'all. Like, escape somehow. And we don't know how, but she makes it out of the prison and all the way to Cuba, where she still lives today. And the United States government had her on the most wanted list for a very long time. Like, she was public enemy #1 at the top of that list for a very long time. And I want to say Eric Holder under the Obama administration, like, put her back on the list and actually raised the bounty. Like, it's like $1 million, like $2 million reward for catching her and bringing her back to America to face her prison time. But yeah, I think he increased the bounty on her head. Like, why would you? Anyway, that's a whole other conversation about Obama and what he was really doing. Anyway, Jesse Jackson is mentioned here. He swoops in. In many ways, the book and other people have depicted Jesse Jackson as like an opportunist. I can't really argue with them on that. Because he claims he was there when Martin Luther King was shot, and he was in the vicinity, but he says Martin Luther King literally died in his arms. And, this young preacher, Jesse, and that, and he had blood on his shirt. Somehow he had blood on his shirt. He was like, "This is the blood of Martin Luther King." And, everybody else who was there was like, he didn't hold Martin Luther King. That's not his blood. I don't even know where he got that blood from, but that bloody shirt is not real. It's not what he says. So he gets on a plane that same evening from Memphis back to his home. I'm talking about Jesse Jackson. And he gets interviewed at the airport, still got the bloody shirt on. So he's being real dramatic about this bloody shirt. And even the next morning he's interviewed and still got the bloody shirt on. Like, you didn't change your shirt, bro? Like, you just really driving this home. You're really milking this, aren't you? So there's that. A little Black History tea. But as the SCLC dies and, SNCC is essentially neutralized by all of this FBI attacking, Jesse Jackson kind of takes advantage of this gap, this moment, and he starts an organization called PUSH. And as you have read in your book, PUSH stands for People United to Save Humanity. It's also called Operation PUSH, the PUSH Coalition. And he runs for president eventually on this platform that kind of is a springboard. PUSH is a springboard for that. In 72, you have the National Black Political Convention. Again, you're getting together all of the major civil rights groups that are still active, and even some members of now defunct civil rights group. You even have a new group called the Congressional Black Caucus, which is established in 1971. So in 1972, at the National Black Political Convention, they show up. Someone who's not necessarily a part of this, but who is in Black politics, is a woman named Shirley Chisholm. She's a Democrat. She runs for president. She does not win, of course, but she doesn't win the Democratic nomination, but she did run on a platform. I think one of her slogans was "unbought and unbossed." Like, she wasn't running with some big, funds, big money behind her, but she, her experiences, and her interpretation of her experiences is that she faced more opposition for being a woman running for president than for being Black running for president. And both of her parents are from, I think they say Barbados. There she comes. I don't know, but it's in there. Which, again, like, people think that this whole African American thing is just so neat. Like, it's just the Black people who went through slavery here that matter. And I'm like, we've always been dealing with each other. Like, Malcolm X's mama, has Caribbean, and I think Guyana. Marcus Garvey from Jamaica. Both of her parents are from the Caribbean. Shirley Chisholm. So, like, there's Arturo Schomburg, who's Puerto Rican. Like, you have so many different, like, we've always been together in the struggle. Now there are people in our society who would like to change that and try to, like, re-separate us and make us hate and look at each other with suspicion. I would urge you not to buy into that, because we have all suffered on all sides of the Atlantic Ocean behind this stuff. Unfortunately, the National Black Political Convention is not the moment of political unity that they intended it to be. The Nation of Islam is eventually dismantled. Louis Farrakhan tries to kind of like reinvigorate the Nation of Islam. SNCC is just gone. One of the phrases is, we went in with guns and we came out with jobs. Like, the Black Power movement in some ways is neutralized by like locking up and terrorizing young people. But another way that they sought to like neutralize the movement is by giving some of the Black people who are still like integrationists, giving them prominent government positions and very conspicuous jobs and, at least the veneer of leadership in this country. So there was this idea by the mid 70s, certainly by the late 70s, that we have made progress. Like, again, people like Thurgood Marshall, you have Clarence Thomas, Barbara Jordan, all these people who have, again, these very visible positions within the American political structure. You have this very important, very intense media focus on like Black wealth. The handful of Black people who are like wealthy, like they're pushed in our face over and over again to put forth this idea that this is what we are aspiring to and that we really have overcome. So why are you still talking about all this? Like, we've made it. Shut up, Black people. And of course, we know that's not true, but that's still what the media is like. The media would have you believe that since we've got ball players and rappers and housewives or whatever, like we've made it and the sky is the limit if we only work hard. And like, that distracts you from seeing all of the cards that are stacked against you and the fact that most of us are still living below the poverty line, and most of us are still lacking in an education that empowers us. Most of us don't even know who we are. Most of us don't know our history. Most of us don't know our past relationships with each other and ourselves. Like, we're still in the dark. Or as some people have said, we're being blinded by a very bright white light and can't see beyond it. In any case, the gains from this movement, however, are the cultural legacy. There's a cultural and an intellectual legacy of this movement that still lives on. We still have Kwanzaa. We still have people who are interested in upholding African heritage as a source of strength and unity for us. We still have, Black studies programs, obviously. We have, the ability to study Black history in colleges and university. Movies like Roots came out to really start the conversation about slavery and the legacy of racism in this country. Other types of Black actors like Cicely Tyson and LeVar Burton came on the scene. Maya Angelou got into acting, like to really kind of steer us in a direction of like, we are producing artwork for us, an artwork that is about us, and art that gives us dignity even in the mainstream, right? So I'm a beneficiary of all this. This cultural intellectual legacy is the one I've inherited, like my generation. These are our elders. These are people like we learned from and grew up watching and reading. But again, these are gains, but then some people would think that the Black moderates are, a gain, and, like their success is our success. Thurgood Marshall is our success. We're moving into the 80s. Oprah Winfrey is our success, we got, Reading Rainbow and Sesame Street that has Black characters, and like these represent success and inclusion. And of course you could argue that they do. It's just on whose terms. That's always the question that these young people were trying to raise. Like, what is the quality of what we've been given? Is it really what we need? Can we think for ourselves and determine what we need, or will we just take what is handed to us and accept it blindly? Any case, I've really enjoyed all of this. I'm going to leave it there because once we get into the 80s, we have like this conservative Black upswing, and that is kind of, in some ways it's a moment I was born into. I was born in 1982. So like right after this chapter is like my chapter, you know? And so this is a society in which we are trying to move past and in some ways forget what those young people went through and all the terror of the previous decade, and kind of like celebrate. We're trying to like help ourselves feel better by like focusing on progress and inclusion. And, you know, America is also having a very conservative upswing at this time. You've got Nixon, and then you've got Reagan, who is like, I'm going to kill any last crumbs of Black power. You know, and that starts a whole other conversation about drugs and the war on drugs in the Black community, which, like the rest of this, like poverty and all those other things, and ghettos, all those things are by design. I urge you to look more into those things and not just take things at face value. Trust yourself, trust your people, and thank you.